Tjena, tack för besöket. Welcome. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Cedars-Sinai. We are honored to have you here. This is the third time we've had the privilege of hosting a medical conference with Harav Usher Weiss. The first time we did it on end-of-life issues, and the second time we did it on mental health issues. And tonight we're discussing beginning-of-life issues. I want to first thank Rabbi Yossi Sprung. Rabbi Sprung in the back. Rabbi Sprung helped to organize this event, and I want to mention, it's important that people should know, Rabbi Sprung recently founded the Beis Medrash Gavoa for Refuah and Halacha. This is an institute connected to the Technion American Medical School, where a medical student can go through a 5-year program to earn their medical degree, which includes in it full-time learning, Torah learning, focused on medical halacha. And Rabbi Sprung is the Rosh Beit Midrash. He's also the director of the program. And Rav Weiss is the Nasi. He's the head of the program, and he gives shir every few weeks. This is a chance for someone to graduate from medical school through an American program in Israel with a strong foundation in Torah learning, in the sugyas and the issues that are relevant for someone who's concerned about Jewish law and the practice of medicine. It's really an incredible program, and we wish him lots of luck and success. And if anyone knows anyone who's interested in going to medical school, especially with the opportunity to go to medical school in Israel and add in an extra year and to be able to have this expertise with some of the most incredible teachers in the world, please let them know about this program. I can help get you in touch with Rabbi Sprung if you'd like. And again, it's called the Beis Medrash Gavoa for Refuah and Halacha through the Technion American Medical School. It's something very kedai, something to know about. This evening, as I mentioned, we're focusing on beginning-of-life issues, a little different than what we've covered in the past. Unfortunately, it's an area that needs to be talked about, something that sometimes there's a stigma attached or shame or concerns. And so what we'll do tonight is that Rav Weiss will share us a presentation. He'll share some of the key questions that come up and concerns. And what we'll do is about 15 minutes into the presentation, I'll walk up and down the aisles. I'll have some note cards and some pens. And if you have any questions, just raise your hand and I'll give you the pen and note card. I'll do that a few times. And as we're going through, I'll collect the questions. And when Rav Weiss finishes, I'll begin to present the questions to him. And I'll continue to walk through the aisles. So if you have questions that come up, please share them with me on the note card and we'll make sure they get asked. These are some very important issues that we're going to discuss tonight. And Rav Weiss will describe them, whether it's genetic screening or PGD or surrogacy. These are issues that in the entire world, they're struggling with the ethical ramifications of these decisions. And in the Jewish world, we have some very specific questions, whether it regards using these treatments on Shabbat, which might be a unique application of this, or holidays, or status questions. Who's considered the mother for a patient born through surrogacy? We also have the privilege of having on hand tonight Dr. Jessica Chan of Cedars-Sinai's Center for Fertility and Reproductive Medicine. Maybe Dr. Chan, you could raise your hand. So if there's any specific questions, anyone needs a referral to talk to someone in our community, she's here to help. And if any specific medical questions arise, she'll be there to help out. These questions are, as I mentioned, very difficult, very challenging. People struggle with them. And what's beautiful and fascinating is that the Torah has answers and guidance. Even our ancient Torah is relevant in the modern world and provides incredibly sophisticated, detailed, and nuanced guidance. And, I often think when I'm in this room about this mural. This mural here is the Jewish contributions to medicine, starting with Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses in the back with the Nachash and Nechoshes, the copper serpent, moving through the Talmud, Maimonides, to the modern era. Sometimes I think about it as almost like a chain, the Masorah of medicine. Sometimes in medicine, people sometimes think that like in the modern world, everything's good, and in the past, no one knew anything. And I love this mural because it reminds us that we stand on the shoulders of giants and that there's a tradition. And this is really what we're doing here tonight, because not only is there a medical Masorah, a medical tradition, but in Judaism, even more so, we rely on tradition. We rely on a chain of tradition. And in every generation, we have the honor and the privilege of having individuals who guide us through challenging new questions and new problems and the way to live a Torah life in each generation. And it's not simple, and not everyone can do it. But thank God in every generation, God has made sure that we have had someone who could do that. And without embarrassing him or speaking in a way that would make him feel uncomfortable, I feel strongly that in our generation, the person who HaKadosh Baruch Hu has granted us with the ability to guide us through these challenging questions is Harav Asher Weiss Shlita. Rabbi Weiss is someone who's turned to in all sorts of modern questions. You might just read in the paper this week that the Israeli project of going to space is consulting with Rav Weiss with their halachic questions. We know that the IDF, the Mossad, the Secret Service in Israel, consults with Rav Weiss. Intel has Mobileye, creating the self-driving cars. They have to answer ethical questions, these cars. Who do they turn to? Rav Asher Weiss. Not only that, but he is the posek for Shaarei Tzedek Medical Center, the official rabbinic decider for the largest halachically run Jewish hospital in the world, a hospital that we have had a lot of connection with. Dr. Melmed is here, and someone who's enabled that connection, and Paul Jesser of American Friends of Shaarei Tzedek is here for this occasion. So Rav Weiss is that person that guides us through. How? It'll be clear, I think, once you hear him tonight, and most of you, I'm sure, have before. He combines exactly what it takes to be that leader of the generation. First and foremost, an incredibly deep and broad and profound knowledge. Yedias HaTorah being a Talmud Chacham par excellence. Incredible knowledge. Beyond that, he additionally has an incredible compassion for humans, an understanding, a respect for people. And he has the ability to apply this wisdom, this compassion to the modern world. Today we had the privilege of sitting with Rav Weiss, with the leading rabbis of the city. If you ever want to know, who does the rabbi turn to when the rabbi doesn't know? It's Rav Asher Weiss. And so without further ado, we are honored to call upon Rav Asher Weiss to address us this evening.
Good evening to everyone. First, I wanted to thank my dear friend and Talmud, Rabbi Weiner, for his kind and somewhat exaggerated introduction. It's a simcha, a privilege, and an honor to be here again. As we just heard, it's my third opportunity. And yes, our first opportunity was about end-of-life questions. I think beginning-of-life questions have a somewhat happier note than end-of-life questions, but similar challenges. We grapple with the question, to what extremes do we need to go to sustain life? And we grapple with the questions, to what extremes do we need to go to bring forth life? And many times I tell my friends, rabbis, my disciples, my Talmidim, that our generation really needs giants like Maimonides and Nachmanides and the great giants of yore, because the challenges we have and the questions we need to deal with are unprecedented, and questions our forefathers couldn't even imagine. And we try to find sources, and not always do we find clear sources. So sometimes you need to apply your intuition, your collective knowledge based on the Torah that you learned all your life, and it is indeed a challenge. Not only in medicine, but in many other fields, technology and halakha, even in economics. We have new financial instruments, not machines, but financial ideas and instruments that were unheard of in the past. But the challenge is all that more fundamental and acute when it comes to medicine, because we're dealing with the lives and the well-being of people. So this is a unique challenge, humbling, challenging, and we try to rise to the challenge. So as Rabbi Weiner, and I think he's doing an amazing job here in Cedars-Sinai, a young but unbelievably talented rabbi, and my blessings from the depth of my heart. Keep up your great work. So IVF, PGD are two amazing breakthroughs. The first IVF baby was born 41 years ago, Louise Brown, born in 1978. And the two doctors that developed this procedure were Dr. Edwards and Dr. Steptoe. One of them got a Nobel Prize. And since then, millions of babies were born in this way. 1% of all babies born in America are by IVF. Israel tops the list in the world. 4% of babies born in Israel are born by IVF. Which just is testimony to what children are to a Jewish family. So 4% of babies born in Israel are born in IVF. It's 1% in North America, which is an amazing number, even in America, more so in Israel. So many young couples that just not many years ago would have no hope. We have the ability today to give them the biggest blessing of life, which is children. So in vitro fertilization has become standard procedure, and so is PGD, which is pre-implementation genetic diagnosis, or PGS, which would be screening, or PGT, pre-implementation genetic testing. So IVF is performed for many reasons. Couples that cannot conceive in a natural way, or couples that could conceive but have become aware of some genetic disorders that might cause their offspring, their babies, to be born with severe deformations or other syndromes. So we recommend in vitro fertilization. Sometimes these couples have no other way to conceive. Would a person be mekayim the precept, the mitzvah of priya urviya? Would a person be considered as performed his halachic, biblical precept to bring children to the world if he does so by IVF? Definitely yes. Would it be obligatory, a couple that can't have children in a normal way? Would it be an obligation to bring children to the world by IVF? No. One has to do what God provided him the means to do in a natural way, to bring children to the world. One does not have to resort to modern, innovative ways to bring children to the world, but we definitely recommend it. So on one hand, would not be defined as an obligation, but on the other hand, definitely would be defined as a mitzvah, as a precept, as the right thing to do. So in the first volume of my responsa in Minchat Asher, I ruled that when a couple is aware of a genetic disorder, they don't have an obligation to bring children to the world, because they're not obligated to bring children to the world when the risk is high that those children might have a life of pain, suffering, but we definitely would recommend to those couples to go for IVF. When would we recommend screening? So when a couple turns to IVF because they are aware of genetic disorders or incompatibility, we definitely would say do IVF and PGD to determine, in as much as we can determine, that the embryos that are returned to the woman's body are the healthy ones. But when a couple turns to IVF, not because they're aware of any genetic mutations or problems, but naturally they have problems conceiving in a natural way, would we still recommend PGD? Or would we say, just like any other couple that brings children to the world without knowing in advance what that might incur, the same with IVF. Why check out when you have no reason to be worried? But it still definitely would be legitimate if we have the means before those embryos are put back into the woman's body. Why not be on the safe side? So in that case, I don't think it would be obligatory, but definitely would be legitimate. So if we did produce embryos in the Petri dish before inserting them back into the uterus, we would recommend do PGD. What are we looking for, and to what extremes do we go? I don't think we need to check out everything possible. At some stage, we just turn our eyes up to the heavens and say, Hashem, care for us and guard us from everything that would be painful or bad. But so IVF and PGD are amazing breakthroughs that enable happiness to so many couples that just a few decades ago would have no hope at all. So as I said, IVF definitely would be the mitzvah of prior via. It would not be a chiyuv, it would not be an obligation, but definitely something that we would recommend. So an embryo that is in a dish, would it have the same halachic significance as pregnancy? No, it won't. Because 1,000 years ago, the first psak, or the first ruling, was given. Do we violate Shabbat to save a pregnancy? And the Ran and the Rosh, many of the early halachic rulers, quote from Rav Yehudai Gaon Ba'alochas Gedolos. Yes, it would be permissible to violate Shabbos, not only to save a human being, but also to save an embryo, a potential human being. And the reasoning would be what we find in Masechet Yoma, page 85, Daf Pei in Masechet Yoma, Chalel alav Shabbat achad kedei sheyishmor Shabbatot harbe. Yes, we will transgress and violate one Shabbat to enable the child, the person to live, or the child to be born and preserve so many others. So yes, we do violate Shabbos to save an embryo. Would the same apply to an embryo that is not in his mother's uterus? No, we would not violate Shabbos and do a biblical violation or transgression. But in my opinion, when we're dealing with a rabbinical violation, yes. Because giving a couple the ability to bring children to the world would be defined at least what Chazal define as a chole she'ein bo sakana. So a person is ill, and he does not have a life-threatening condition, we still would be lenient in many rabbinical violations, and I think the same would apply to enabling a couple to bring children to the world. One of the major issues with modern technologies and breakthroughs in beginning of life is the question of surrogacy. Who is considered the halachic mother? Would it be the egg donor or the woman that donates her womb or uterus? So when the embryo is brought to be with the sperm and the egg of one woman and then implanted into the uterus of another woman, who would be defined as the halachic mother? In my personal humble opinion, I feel very strongly that the woman that donates the egg, she is the halachic mother. However, we do not have clear sources to prove this point, and therefore most of halachic authorities in our generation feel that we need to I don't find the right word. Tzarich lahachmir, we need to be cautious in both possibilities, and therefore we would consider each of these women as a potential mother. With the advance of science and technology, today we might have 3 moms to the same baby, because today we could pluck out the mitochondria of the egg and use the egg of one woman, the mitochondria of another woman, and the uterus of number 3. So now we have 3 potential mothers. So I wrote about this as well, and because 99% of the genetic code is not in the mitochondria, even though the mitochondria contributes the energy to the development of the cells, I still think that the halachic mother would be the one who contributes the majority of the genetic code and not the one that contributes the mitochondria. So we have very serious halachic questions, and we try to deal with them and find answers. And this is a great challenge. And I think the interaction and the discussion between professionals in the medical field and professionals in the rabbinical field is of extreme importance, and it is crucial, and we have so much to learn from each other. And once a year, we have a very meaningful conference in my Beit Din in Yerushalayim, and that is before Yom Kippur, when about 100 rabbis come together, and we have a panel of doctors in respective fields, and the rabbis present questions, and the doctors analyze the questions and feed me with the relevant medical information and enable me to give the halachic response and ruling. So this is a most important endeavor in which I am involved on a daily basis in Israel and throughout the world. And we had many medical conferences in the East Coast, in New York, and in Florida, and we had one in London and in Israel. And I'm happy to be for the 3rd time here in Cedars-Sinai. So I wondered in the past, where does the name Cedars-Sinai come from? Because there are no cedars in Sinai. Sinai is a desert. It's a mountain in the middle of the Sinai desert, and the cedars are in Lebanon. So this is quite a strange name, Cedars-Sinai. So I was made to understand that once upon a time there were two major Jewish facilities in Los Angeles. One was Mount Sinai and the other was Cedars of Lebanon. And when they merged, that is how Cedars-Sinai came to be. So merging sometimes is of extreme importance. So in IVF, we merge sperm and egg. And in our respective fields, we try to merge medical and halachic knowledge and to come up with the answers that our generation really needs. So thank you all for coming this evening, and I will be more than happy to try to respond to questions.
Okay, I'll begin going through some of the questions that have come in. I'll give Rav Weiss 3 of the first questions, then I'll ask more. One question is using IVF or artificial insemination or PGD for gender selection of the fetus permissible according to halacha? Another question was, if a couple has exhausted all options to have children and are still unsuccessful, due to the man's sperm count, or sperm problems, would finding a sperm donor be allowed, or is adoption preferable? And a third one was, can a Jewish nurse play any role in assisting with an abortion or removal of intrauterine fetal demise? What are the restrictions, if any?
Yes, 3 very weighty questions, so we will try to respond one at a time. What was the first question?
The first question was gender selection.
Yes. I don't think it would be a violation of halacha doing IVF for gender selection. I don't think the law permits it in Israel, because we must understand IVF is not a picnic. It's a very serious medical procedure, which many times is traumatic, more to the mother than to the father. But it's a very serious medical procedure involving hormonal treatment, and it should be saved for when it is really needed, meaning when couples have difficulty in conceiving or when we are concerned about the high risk of genetic mutations. So I don't think it is a violation of halacha, but it is definitely something that we would not recommend. And I would prefer couples being happy with whatever babies HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God, decides to give them. I am one of 7 brothers, and I'm sure my mother would love to have some daughters as well. And we are 7 brothers. I have no sisters. I have 6 girls and 1 boy. Not a very balanced family, but we were so happy with what HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us. So I definitely don't think we should encourage or recommend IVF for gender selection. But I don't think it would be a violation of halacha. But I don't think the law in Israel permits IVF just for gender selection, and wisely so. I think this is a procedure which really should be saved for when it is really needed. Question number 2.
Can I add on that though? Once IVF is being done, would a person be allowed to make the selection?
Yes. So it is not enough for IVF. We would need PGT to determine the gender of the embryo. And in that case, usually not all the embryos are inserted back into the uterus. We choose the fittest ones and the best ones. And in that case, I think, yes, in that case, once it was performed, I think it would be legitimate for a couple to decide based on the gender, but that should not be the main concern, but the most fitting embryos, those are the ones that should be used.
The other 2 were related to artificial insemination from a donor, or if adoption is preferable from getting it from a donor?
Yes, so sperm donation is a very major halachic controversy. Rav Moshe Feinstein, probably most of you are familiar with this halachic giant, was lenient. Many others were stringent, and these are two very well-known opinions. I think that the Igrot Moshe Rav Moshe was a minority opinion, but I think he was the greatest posek of our time, of our generation. So, from the halachic standpoint, adaptation would definitely be preferable to sperm donation. But from the standpoint of father and mother, sperm donation definitely would come before adaptation. So I think couples should consult their rabbis and their authorities regarding this question.
And a Jewish nurse playing any role in an abortion?
An abortion is not always a transgression. You ask, could a Jewish nurse be involved in an abortion, as if terminating a pregnancy is always a violation of halacha? And that is not so. There are cases in which we would permit terminating a pregnancy. So without going into many details, sometimes terminating a pregnancy would even be recommended in some cases. So the question applies to a situation in which there is no halachic or ethical justification to the abortion. Could a Jewish nurse be involved? One of the problems we have in our modern world is that not always could a medical professional say, refuse and say, I don't take part in this procedure. He might lose his job. So I don't know whether a nurse is entitled by law to say, I don't do this. I don't know. But I do think that a medical professional that just does a support role in the procedure. I was asked by anesthesians, could I do anesthesia when an operation is not halachically validated? And my response is yes. I mean, you're not doing the abortion. You just have a support role. If you're not going to do it, someone else will do it. And I think if his profession is at risk, he definitely could participate. So I know that this is an opinion that others might argue against, but that is my opinion.
If the nurse was actually the one administering the drugs to cause an abortion, would that be different, or a doctor?
So once again, if the abortion is justified, that would not be a problem. If the abortion is not justified, she should abstain or refrain from administering the drugs and actually bringing forth the abortion.
Can a Jewish woman who's already had children and is married and just wants to help other people, is it permissible for her to offer to serve as a surrogate for other women?
Surrogacy, once again, is a halachic issue, and some great halachic authorities are against surrogacy. I think surrogacy is permissible according to halacha, and therefore I think offering to be a surrogate for another lady that cannot have babies on her own would not only be permissible, it would be a mitzvah. It would be a chesed. If it is permissible, then it's a chesed. Then it's an act of mercy, and it should not only be permitted, but also encouraged.
How about if the woman get paid to be a surrogate?
Can one get paid to be a surrogate?
I think just like donating an organ for money is wrong, donating your uterus for money is wrong. But I think if the family wants to express its gratitude to a woman for being a surrogate mother. They're entitled to do so. Why do I say it's wrong to offer a limb for money or offer your uterus for money? I think it's a very troubling phenomenon because it is extremely important that a person who gives away a limb, a kidney, or donates her uterus do so in the right state of mind, with deep conviction, and being mentally, psychologically, emotionally fit to do so. But when you're getting paid, and that will impair your approach, your attitude, and that is why I think, I think by law, it's a breach of law to donate a limb for money or to pay for a limb. And I think the same would apply to surrogacy.
Related to surrogacy, some people might know that this hospital is looking into creating uterus donation program. Are there any halachic issues to be aware of with uterus donation? Is there anything about who's the mother? Anything that we should be thinking about in that regard?
This is a very, very fascinating question, because on one hand, even a more fascinating question would be donating an ovary or a testicle, because the eggs and the ovaries, not everybody knows that, are all there when the baby is born. They just come to fruition in adulthood. But the ovaries do not produce eggs. They're all in the ovary when the baby is born. So when we transplant an ovary from one woman to the other, the genetic code is entirely the one of the donor, and the recipient will have no genetic input. But nevertheless, my opinion is any organ that is transplanted into a living person's body becomes part of him. And therefore, the baby that is born will halachically be the baby of the recipient of the ovary, the baby of the recipient of the testicle. Regarding the uterus, the question isn't that crucial because, to the best of my knowledge, I know some researchers and scientists presently argue to the contrary. But to the best of my knowledge and understanding, the uterus has no genetic input. And the genetics will be entirely by the egg donor and not by the woman, which the baby will develop in her belly, in her uterus. So uterus donation would just be like heart transplantation or kidney transplantation. And when you get a heart transplant, it is not that Reuven's heart is in Shimon's chest. And, we all hope to have a good heart, not only physically, but more spiritually, purity of heart. So when you take a heart or a kidney or a liver or a lung or any other organ out of one body and transplant it into the other, it becomes part of the donor's body. The same would apply to a uterus, and the same would apply to an ovary or a testicle, even though that would be a very fascinating phenomena, because genetically, that baby would be the child of the ovary donor. Halachically, it would be definitely considered the child of the recipient of that ovary, and the same would apply to a uterus. There is halachic concern because severing or damaging reproductive organs, male or female, is a transgression in halacha. So removing the uterus from a lady's body is a halachic problem. We do so in many cases. When a woman's life is in danger, it definitely is permissible to remove her ovaries and uterus, and we're all familiar with the BRCA genes. Not only when her life is in danger, when, halachically, some women have difficulty with the preparations to enable them to go to the mikveh, and we permit removing the uterus in many different cases. And that is based on halachic analysis and discussion. So removing reproductive organs from a one's body, according to the Vilna Gaon and according to the Gro, that would be a dioraisa, a biblical transgression. According to most other opinions, it would be a rabbinical transgression. The Turezov is very lenient about it. So in extreme cases, we are lenient. The question is, could a woman remove the uterus from her body just to help another woman conceive? That is a very serious question.
Related, someone asked, when it comes to the BRCA gene, may or must a person do PGD to try to avoid passing on the BRCA gene to their children?
She definitely may. And that once again would be achieved by IVF and PGD. I would not say it is an obligation, but I definitely say it would be recommended. And a follow-up question would be, halachically, would we recommend at some stage to a woman that does have the BRCAG to remove her ovaries? Once again, I would not say that is a halachic obligation, but it is something I definitely recommend. And I have recommended it to many, many women, because preserving life overrides any other consideration.
When PGD is done, what should be done with the leftover embryos that are not implanted?
An embryo in a dish is not considered, doesn't have the same significance of an embryo in its mother's body. And the embryos that are left over, and we do not intend to use them, could be discarded of, or many cases, I say, they could be donated to medical research. We just need to be 100% sure that they won't be used for another woman. And in some third world countries, that is what is done. So if you have this procedure anywhere, not in we never name individuals. I don't even want to name countries. But many of these procedures are done in third world countries, and many of those embryos find their way into the bodies of women. And that definitely should be prevented. But I think these embryos could be discarded of, and they could be donated to medical research.
There was a question, what are some of the sources that a rabbi such as Rav Weiss uses when answering these questions related to PGD, surrogacy, who's the mother, IVF? What are some of the sources from Chazal?
As I mentioned before, we have very, very few sources. And the ones we do have, many are basically not halachic sources, but agadaic sources from the Midrash. And there's discussion an argumentation going back 300 years. So this is a statement we do not find in Bavlioni and Yerushalmi, not in the Babylonian Talmud, but in the Yerushalmi Talmud. Ein lameiden halacha min Agoda. We don't learn halacha from Agadaic sources. Does everybody know what halacha and Agoda are? So Agoda is more not clear halachic ruling or principle, but rather stories that we find in Chazal. So the Noida B'Yehuda maintains that the interpretation of this Yerushalmi is when there is contradiction between halachic sources and Agadaic sources, then halacha always has the upper hand. But both the Shvus Yankiv and the Maharal, going back 400 years, maintain that even if there is no contradiction between halacha and Agada, we don't learn halacha from Agada. So primarily, our conclusions are based on not on clear sources, but rather on svara, on, as I said before, your intuitive feeling developed by your Torah knowledge. And there is an expression that we find in Chazal, Zerahu Av, the seed of a father. And Rashi Masechet Chulin uses the same expression, Zera Ha'em, and that is primarily my source. If Rashi uses the expression Zera Ha'em, the seeds of the mother, equivalent to the expression in Chazal, the seeds of the father, to me that means that just like the father's seed makes him a father, and the seed his son, the same applies to the mother. And therefore the egg donor would be considered the halachic mother and not the woman that the embryo develops in her body. And it is also because the genetic code, even though the genetic code in itself would not determine fatherhood or motherhood, as I explained regarding ovary transplants.
There was a question, if a couple, it's a two-part question really. Must a couple do genetic screening before they get engaged? Should it be open screening or closed screening where they only find out if they're compatible or not? If a couple is dating and falls in love and wants to get married and then finds out that they're both carriers for a very severe genetic illness, may they still get married? What advice would the Rav give them?
Not always do we have clear-cut responses in halacha, and that is why in the short while we're discussing questions together, I think more than once or twice or 3 or 4 times I said what I would recommend and what should be recommended, and not everything is a clear halachic ruling. I can say that people are required to do genetic screening prior to getting engaged. The fact is that for thousands of years, we didn't do it. We didn't have the ability to do it, so one cannot say there is a halachic obligation to have genetic screening before deciding to get married. But once again, it is something that we recommend because it prevents so much pain and so much suffering and so many tears. So it is something that in our community we definitely recommend. So to prevent a situation in which a couple falls in love and they are engaged or even married, and then they become aware of genetic incompatibility, we definitely would prefer that this is done before they really become engaged. And that is why we definitely recommend what is called Dor Yesharim or other organizations. So there are 2 basic approaches. One approach says, why burden people with the knowledge that they have some genetic disorder? All we will do is tell the couple, you're not a good fit, without disclosing to the people who was the one that might have this mutation and what exactly is it? On the other hand, this is the info age, and people are entitled to know what they want to know. So I do not have an opinion which of the two approaches I would recommend, and I think people have the right to choose. And some people would prefer to know what their genetic profile is and whether they have genetic problems. Other people would prefer, why get into it? Why burden myself and my family with this knowledge? So King Solomon, the wisest of men, says, Yosif Da'at, Yosif Machov. Sometimes more knowledge is more pain. But Reb Mendele of Kutsk said, we'll have more pain, but we want to have more knowledge. And we're willing to pay the price for that additional knowledge. Not everybody is willing to pay the price for that additional information. It's not additional wisdom or even additional knowledge. It's additional information. So I think both approaches are valid, and let people choose which one they want.
Okay, I don't know what this is. Is uterine ablation considered serous? What if it's done for lifestyle or needed difficulties, not for medical
Once
need?
again?
Uterine ablation. Doctor, you want to?
Prevent having?
Would that be, if that's done for lifestyle or needed difficulties, would that be considered serous?
This question is new to me. Is this a procedure that's been here for a long time? Yes? Yes. I am familiar with uterine ablation when there is excessive bleeding and we don't have the means to stop that bleeding in any other way. Would it be permissible as?
Serous. That was the question.
I don't think it, because I said I did not deal with this question, I usually am not very happy to give halachic ruling without doing thorough research. My feeling is it would not be defined as serous, it would not be halachic transgression, but once again, I don't think it should be recommended. I think any procedure like this probably has its downsides, and I wouldn't recommend it, but I do not think it would be defined as a halachic transgression, but I want to revisit and recheck this question.
Also, I'll point out a few people asked if they could ask questions afterwards because there's some sort of private questions, so
Yeah,
we'll make sure to
definitely.
do that. Another question that came up a couple times was, is it required during IVF retrieval to have a shomer, someone watching over the process? And also, can these procedures, IVF, be done on Shabbos and Yom Tov, or are there any exceptions?
No, the procedures cannot be performed on Shabbos and Yom Tov, but there are sometimes, preparation that demands either injections, taking medicines, which definitely would be permissible on Shabbos and Yom Tov, but the actual procedure should not be performed on Shabbos or Yom Tov. And what was the other question?
A shomer for the IVF process.
Yes. Yeah, even though every responsible medical facility has its system of verifying that no mistakes are made. Everybody understands, every different person and every decent professional understands how tragic mishaps could be. But by halachic criteria, we should have halachic supervision. So in Shari Tzedek, we have our own internal halachic supervision, but in most other facilities in Israel, people turn to different organizations that supply halachic supervision. In Shari Tzedek, We have our own system.
This is a little bit outside of the fertility area, but when the Rav spoke about mitochondrial DNA, if one can one use halachically mitochondrial genetic testing to determine parenthood, or for criminal cases, do we rely on DNA?
What is unique about mitochondrial DNA, the male has no input, and it is totally maternal. And that is why it might have extreme ramifications in determining Jewishhood. And so I am presently in the midst of research and halachic definition. I already wrote an article about this, but I still am further examining from the scientific point of view and the halachic point of view whether mitochondrial DNA would be sufficient to determine whether a person is Jewish or not. Because whether you're Jewish or not depends nothing on who your father or grandfather was. It depends only on mother. And therefore, mitochondrial DNA testing would have far-reaching implications more than other DNA. Generally, I publicized a tshuva, an essay. I think it's in the second volume of my responsa, Shalosh Tshuvas Minchas Osha. And I determined that genetical DNA testing would not be sufficient to determine that a person is a mamzer, but it would be sufficient in bearing leniency in many other questions, and also in determining who the father is.
There were a couple of questions. This is also a little bit outside of fertility, but CRISPR technology has been in the news lately, whereby geneticists manipulate a person's DNA to prevent certain illnesses. Are there any halachic concerns or guidelines when it comes to CRISPR technology manipulating a person's genes?
You are exposing my ignorance. But because I'm such an extremely humble person, I don't mind. I don't know enough about this technology. But if it's manipulating your genes to prevent illness, I don't know why that would be wrong, what the problem will be, but I need to learn more about the science and technology of the procedure.
Okay. There are a couple of questions. At what point in halacha, and what are the sources for it, at what point does life begin, and is that different when one gets pregnant through IVF?
Life begins when a baby is born. However, the life of a fetus is also precious. But let us make this very clear. A fetus in halacha is not defined fully as a person or as a human being. And that is why the Mishnah says, when a fetus endangers the mother's life, we destroy the fetus to save the mother. The moment the baby is born, even if he is partially born, his life is as precious as his mother's life.
Visiting hours will be over in 15 minutes.
Can ignore it.
Was that meant for us?
Nope.
May I have your attention? May I have your attention?
So,
Visiting hours will be over in 15 minutes.
so the Mishnah clearly says, if the fetus endangers his mother's life, we destroy the fetus to save the mother. If his head is out of the canal, then we no longer would hurt the baby to save the mother. So this makes it very clear. A fetus is precious. And terminating any pregnancy is a very grave and serious halachic question. But real total life begins when a baby is born. The neshama, when does a person get a neshama? When he is conceived or when he is born? That's a discussion between Rebbe and Antoninos. But by halachic definition, one is considered a living human being the moment he is born. However, as I said, potential life is also precious, and that is why terminating a pregnancy is a very grave question, and it is only permissible in very unique and serious situations. So, IVF. The moment the embryo is back in the uterus, it makes no difference at all how it came to be. But as long as the embryo is not implanted in a woman's body, then that is not even potential life as a ubar or a fetus in a woman's body is. And therefore, as I said before, when we have extra embryos, which we do not intend to use, they could be destroyed halachically, and there's no need to preserve them for eternity.
Next question, maybe we'll start to wrap up. It's two questions. Is there a point at which a single woman should consider freezing her eggs? And a related question, may a woman serve as a surrogate for another woman in her family?
Sometimes, yes, we would recommend a single woman to freeze her eggs, because if she approaches the age in which pregnancy would become more problematic, and we would recommend freezing her eggs to be used at a later stage when she gets married. And what was the follow-up question?
If a woman may ever serve as a surrogate for another woman in her family.
Yes. In her family, right?
A relative of hers, yeah.
Yes.
Are there any last questions before we conclude? We'll allow people, of course, Rav Weiss will stick around for a little bit to answer private questions privately.
Could take some spontaneous questions.
Anyone else's questions? There was a couple that I couldn't read. So, yes, Dora.
Definitely IVF and PGD. Terminating a pregnancy even before 40 days is still a very grave halachic issue. I definitely would recommend IVF and PGD. And not all genetic disorders could be found at such an early stage of pregnancy.
The Rav said that would recommend older single girls to freeze their eggs. Is it something that it's done so that out of marriage that you would conceive?
Oh, I always regret when I say you could have spontaneous questions. And it's always the last question that's the most problematic. Somebody there wanted to ask something?
Should you repeat?
So, one of the ladies raised her hand.
They just wanted to keep the question. Oh, but I don't think they heard the question. Thank you, Rabbi. Now we have the ability to test fetuses with very powerful genetic tests like exome sequencing.
how detailed of an analysis is permissible when we still don't know the answers to what we're finding or the significance of what we're finding?
Will you please explain what you mean when we don't know the answers to what we're finding?
Sure. So right now when we do a regular exome sequence in a regular person, not a fetus, we're still learning if we find a new variant in the genome. We're still learning what it means, if it has clinical significance, if it will really cause disease or not. So when we run tests like that, we sometimes find incidental findings that we can't really predict what their practical meaning will be for a person's life. Is it permissible to do testing like that when we still don't understand quite what we're finding?
Would that testing in any way cause additional risk to the fetus?
That's a good question.
If it will, then it definitely should not be done. And even if it would not put the baby in any additional risk, why would we do that testing? For scientific purposes? So I do not think it should be done. I think when we do PGD, it should be for the sole purpose of helping this couple in having a healthy baby.
What's the halachic view of hermaphrodites?
Of?
Hermaphrodites, in the rare case that someone's born with both male and female.
Rabbi Weiner, would you
Anatomy.
explain to me? Okay, what is the halachic?
The halachic approach or the halachic view of that? Meaning like what you'd hold by in terms of how to identify.
Rabbi Weiner, did you get any questions like these in your papers? Yes, you know, there is a sad side to life and not only a happy one. And we're all so overwhelmed with joy when we have healthy babies, and they're a blessing to the world. But some babies are born with problems and issues, and some of them are very severe. And sometimes the gender of a baby is ambiguous and not very clear, and we find this condition thousands of years ago in the Mishnah, in the Gemara. In many cases, we check the chromosomal structure to determine the true gender of the baby. So it depends on the organs, it depends on the chromosomes, and usually there is a scientific and halachic verdict whether the baby would be considered male or female. That is about the extent I could go into in this public forum.
Hi, Rabbi. Thank you. Does the age of viability, there's been recent discussions, at least here in the United States, about abortions at different stages of pregnancy. Does the age of viability, for example, 20 to 22 weeks, play a role in Jewish law, or the things that permit or not permit abortions at different stages, does that play a role in Jewish law?
Yeah. In Jewish law, there are three determining factors, 3 stages of pregnancy that might have different significance. As mentioned before, 40 days is one milestone.